We saw two big-name wide receivers change teams here this week. Amari Cooper is now a Bill and Devontae Adams is a Jet. But where do they fit in our quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 7? What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Today we're talking about some wide receiver rankings. Now before we dive in to the top tier wide receivers, let's go back and take a look at some of the guys that I hit and miss on in week 6. Now let's start off with the hits. It's Chris Godwin, Stephon Diggs, and Terry McLaurin. I've been super high on Godwin all off season long. I love to see him come out here weekly and put up huge points. How about Stephon Diggs? Had him ranked super high. It paid off this past week. And then Terry McLaurin. The connection between him and Jaden Daniels is here to stay. They really are a perfect match in that offense. Now I also had some pretty big misses as well. DJ Moore, he was a huge disappointment. Keenan Allen, his teammate. The entire reason DJ Moore was a miss for me was because of Keenan Allen. He took everything last week. So obviously I had DJ Moore ranked too high, Keenan Allen too low, and then Brandon Ayuk kind of continues this up and down cycle here for fantasy football. A lot of people are getting overly antsy with Brandon Ayuk. Now, I'm not giving up on him rest of season, but yes, he's probably going to start dropping down the rankings till we see some more consistency. But now it's week 7, so let's go ahead and dive into tier 1. And in tier 1, we got Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Malik Neighbors, Chris Godwin, Terry McLaurin, and Jaden Reed. For Justin Jefferson, he's coming off the bye with a matchup going up against Detroit. He's had at least 90 yards and a touchdown in every single game this year. We know the running game is banged up in Minnesota, and it's super hard to run on Detroit anyway. It's a lot easier to throw on them because they allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After him is Jamar Chase going up against Cleveland. Now, he just had his worst game over the last few weeks. Last week against the Giants, still ended up with 5 catches for 75 yards, but he's the current wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy football, has had at least 16 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, and A.J. Brown just found success against this same Cleveland defense last week. They allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Jamar Chase is at number 2. After him is Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against Minnesota, and the consistency continues. He's had 11 plus fantasy points in 4 straight games, touchdowns in 3 straight games. Really, the biggest concern here is that his targets have decreased now in 4 straight ball games. Really, he's been saved by touchdowns here as of late, but Minnesota is way easier to throw on than run on. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Amon-Ra all the way up at number 3. Number 4 is A.J. Brown going up against the New York Jets. He came back from injury and picked right up where he left off. 6 catches, 116 yards and a touchdown against Cleveland last week. We know that Dallas Goedert is questionable. We know that added attention is going to be going the way of Saquon Barkley in this revenge game, and the New York Giants are right around the league average when it comes to points allowed to opposing wide receivers at 26.4 per game. Then we have his opponent in that game, Malik Neighbors. Finally seems to be progressing through the concussion protocol. We know that if he plays, he's going to get the volume, and this is a great matchup going up against Philadelphia, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Way easier to throw on Philly than run on them. After Neighbors, we got Chris Godwin going up against Baltimore, the current wide receiver 2 overall in fantasy football. He's averaging 17 fantasy points per game, has 5 touchdowns in 6 games, has 53 targets through the first 6 weeks, and this is why I talked about him all off season long. Chris Godwin in the slot is elite. Now he's going against Baltimore, who allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Got Godwin at 6. After him, we got Terry McLaurin going up against Carolina. Now, Carolina allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin are totally in sync after their slower start. McLaurin has had a touchdown or 100 yards receiving in each of his last 4 games. 4 touchdowns over the last 4 games as well. That's why I got him all the way up at number 7. Number 8 is Jaden Reed going up against Houston. Now, he had a minor ankle injury last week and is currently questionable. He's the wide receiver 3 overall, though, and this Green Bay passing offense is just so good. Going up against Houston, they're a lot easier to throw on than run on. And when Jaden Reed is healthy, he's being started, no question. Now, before I dive into tier 2, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, SeatGeek, and I mentioned this in my running back video. Every year during week 18, I take my son to a different stadium. It's the best time for me to really break away from making weekly videos, and him and I can go spend some time together. But it's really becoming pretty expensive, and that's why we had to partner with SeatGeek. Now, I need you to leave me a comment down below of what game we should go to in Week 18. We've already been to Atlanta, Miami, Tampa Bay, Washington, Cincinnati, Carolina, and Arizona, but we got to try to find a good deal, and this is where SeatGeek is going to come in. With over 28 million downloads, they are the #1 rated ticketing app right now. There are over 70,000 events on SeatGeek right now, including concerts, sporting events, festivals, and so much more. They put all the tickets from across the web into one place to help you find a good deal. Each ticket is actually rated on a scale of 1 to 10, so look for the green dots. Green means good, red means bad. And you know that I'm gonna be here to hook you up as well. So head over to SeatGeek, and when you check out, use the referral code Headliners for $20 off. That's right, that's $20 off your first purchase with promo code Headliners. Make sure you either click the link in the description or in the pinned comment of this video. Go out there and find your own Week 18 game to go to and get $20 off using the promo code Headliners. But all right, let's dive in to Tier 2 now. And Tier 2 is where I got DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Stephon Diggs, Deontay Johnson, Zay Flowers, Drake London, and Deebo Samuel. For DK Metcalf, he's going up against Atlanta. And DK is getting a ton of volume right now, but he is just barely missing out on so many big plays by mere inches or by penalty. He's getting the looks though, and that is what is most important. Atlanta is much easier to throw on than run on, so DK's at number 9. At 10 is where I put Mike Evans in that matchup going up against Baltimore. He's currently the wide receiver 13 overall, but seemed to get some sort of injury last week. He only played in 57% of the snaps, but there's not a whole lot of information out there on this injury right now. Now, obviously, this is a great matchup for him, so if he's good to go, he's going to remain this high in the rankings. If some more news comes out about this injury, he's probably going to drop down a few spots. Right now at number 11, this is where I got Stephon Diggs going up against Green Bay. He didn't really see increased usage due to Nico Collins not being in the lineup. He still hovered right around 80% of the snaps, but he continues to catch almost everything thrown to him. He's the current wide receiver 6 overall and has only had under 11 fantasy points in one game all season long. Now a matchup going up against Green Bay. They allow 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After Diggs, we got Deontay Johnson going against Washington. Now he's currently questionable, so pay attention to his availability throughout the rest of the week, but he is so much better with Andy Dalton. In his first 4 games with Andy Dalton, he's had 43 targets, 24 receptions, 306 yards, and 3 touchdowns. The current wide receiver 19 overall. Now he gets a matchup going up against Washington, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And with this offense in Washington, if they can get an early lead, that means Carolina is going to be throwing the ball all 4 quarters. Number 13, this is where I have Zay Flowers going up against Tampa Bay. Close games are going to mean a lot of Zay Flowers, and those are happening more often than not. He's had back-to-back games now with 120 plus yards. How about 9 plus targets in 4 of his last 6? And Tampa Bay allows over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we already know that Zay Flowers is the #1 wide receiver in Baltimore. Then we go down to Drake London going up against Seattle. The volume is great. 3 straight games with 10 plus targets, 4 touchdowns over his last 5 games, but he's only gone over 75 yards receiving 1 time this season, so he is somewhat touchdown dependent, and this is going to be one of the toughest matchups he's had in quite some time, because Seattle, they allow the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Deebo Samuel going up against Kansas City, and he is living and dying by the big play. He has 335 receiving yards on the season. Almost half of that came on just 2 receptions. It's really like playing whack-a-mole weekly in San Francisco. Who is it gonna be? Is it Deebo? Is it Kittle? Is it Ayuk? It's really impossible to know each and every week. Now, we may see a little bit more involvement in the running game with Jordan Mason banged up right now, but Kansas City allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Deebo is right here at the bottom of Tier 2. So let's go ahead and bring up Tier 3 then, where I got Devontae Smith, Garrett Wilson, Tank Dell, Devontae Adams, Amari Cooper, Brian Thomas, and Brandon Ayuk. Now for Devontae Smith, they got a matchup going up against the New York Giants, and with the injury to Dallas Goedert, we could see more targets going the way of Devontae Smith. Now he has no 100-yard games this season, and only 1 game with over 80 yards, but he does have touchdowns in back-to-back games. Going up against New York, they're among the league average when it comes to points allowed to opposing wide receivers at 26.4. Then we go down to Garrett Wilson going up against Pittsburgh. The Devontae Adams effect is here. What are the targets going to look like now in New York? There's no way that Garrett Wilson keeps his 30% target share. Then on top of that, this is not a great matchup going up against Pittsburgh, who allows the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After Garrett Wilson, we got Tank Dell going up against Green Bay. He's coming off a season high in targets with 9. Not much really down the field though. He only averaged 8.1 yards per reception. For reference, he averaged 15 yards per reception last season. Now without Nico Collins in the lineup, Tank Dell is going to remain startable since Green Bay does allow 27 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. After him, we got Davante Adams in his first game as a Jet. Now it's not like he needs a lot of time to adjust to the quarterback. I think he's pretty familiar with Aaron Rodgers. It really only depends how real the quote-unquote hamstring injury really was. He missed some time in Las Vegas, but was he just trying to get traded? Because after the trade, he's magically a full go in practice and playing this week. Now regardless, this matchup is not easy going up against Pittsburgh, but it's really hard to know what to expect here when it comes to targets going the way of Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. Both of them are elite fantasy options, and that's why they're both right now in the top 20, despite not being higher until we see really who has the ceiling between the two of these guys. After Davante Adams, we got Amari Cooper going up against Tennessee, and he's finally out of Cleveland. Now, they're coming out and saying they do not know whether or not he's going to play for sure, but if he does, I'm putting him right here at number 20. Now, he's got to be glad he's finally out of Cleveland, because now he has a quarterback that can actually get him the football, and he is in line for a huge target share in the coming weeks. Now, it may start off a little bit slow as he gains chemistry with Josh Allen, and this is going to be a difficult matchup this week if he does play against Tennessee, because they allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars going up against New England in that London game. Now, he's currently the wide receiver 11 overall, averaging 12 fantasy points per game, but he's coming off his worst game of the year last week in London. Now he gets another one. Slightly better matchup this week going up against New England. They allow 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Brian Thomas Jr. at 21. 22, it's Brandon Ayuk going up against Kansas City. I know it was another disappointing week last week against Seattle. The targets dropped down to a season low 4 targets in week 6. It just turned out to be a George Kittle game. Like I mentioned earlier, weekly whack-a-mole in San Francisco. Tough matchup going up against Kansas City though, who does allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. Which will then get us through tier 3 onto tier 4, where it's Tyreek Hill, T. Higgins, Juju Smith-Schuster, Jameson Williams, Cooper Kupp, Jordan Addison, Darnell Mooney, and Demario Douglas. For Tyreek Hill, he's got a matchup going up against Indianapolis, and we know the drill here. He is just not the same wide receiver without his quarterback. He hasn't had over 70 yards in a game since week 1. He's the current wide receiver 38 overall, but this is a great matchup for him going up against Indianapolis. It's just too hard to trust him any higher in the rankings. Then we have T. Higgins going against Cleveland, and he's really re-emerged as a viable wide receiver 2 option. 31 targets over the last 3 weeks, but the ceiling is just all over the place. This is a great chance for a good week though this week going up against Cleveland, who allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs going against San Francisco. We've really seen this before from Juju, right back in 2022 when he was a part of the Kansas City Chiefs offense. He was their number 1 wide receiver option there and really provided a safe weekly floor. He's not going to have the ceiling of a Rashee Rice, but he's still going to be solid. San Francisco allows 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Juju Smith-Schuster is Patrick Mahomes' top wide receiver right now. Then we go down to Jameson Williams going up against Minnesota, and he's another one of those guys like Deebo Samuel that's really living off big plays right now. He hasn't had over 4 targets in a game since week 2, and over the last 3 weeks, he has 165 yards receiving, 107 of which came off of just 2 catches. Now a matchup going up against Minnesota. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. That's why he's still this high at 26. Which then brings us to Cooper Kupp, and I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about Cooper Kupp in this matchup going up against Las Vegas. The biggest question is, does he really return or not? We do not know 100% at the time of this recording. Now obviously, they need him, and if he plays, he's going to get big targets. But I really look at it like this. The fact that he isn't a for sure full go at this point kind of gives me pause for the cause. The Raiders are also easier to run on. I'm really watching the limitations of Cooper Kupp heading into the weekend. Then we got Jordan Addison going against Detroit. He's coming off the bye week and has a great matchup this week against the Lions, who allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. With so much attention going the way of Justin Jefferson, that only helps out Jordan Addison weekly. But we also know the run game here is banged up, so Addison could see a few additional targets. After him, we got Darnell Mooney going up against Seattle. And Atlanta is going to need Mooney a lot more this week than they needed him last week against Carolina. Seattle is no easy matchup, but with Bijan and London commanding so much attention, Darnell Mooney should get added looks this week. Plus, Seattle can score on Atlanta. And if they do, Atlanta's going to continue to throw the ball a lot. Darnell Mooney definitely takes a boost in production when that happens. Which will take us to the last receiver in Tier 4, Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots, going up against Jacksonville. Now, he's got back-to-back games with 9 targets and just had his best game of the year with Drake May under center. Now he gets a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. If the rookie can handle an international game, Demario Douglas could have himself a great flex-worthy day. Then we move on to Tier 5, though, where we have Wan'Dale Robinson, Michael Wilson, Xavier Worthy, Ladd McConkey, Cortland Sutton, and Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, for Wan'Dale Robinson, it sure sounds like Malik Neighbors is going to make it back this week, which means a lot less defensive attention going the way of Wan'Dale Robinson. He hasn't really been able to do much with this added defensive attention the last couple weeks, but the volume is still there, and the volume is what we're chasing in a game in which they're going to have more success throwing than running. Then we have Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the Chargers. With Marvin Harrison Jr. in the concussion protocol, we could easily see Michael Wilson get 10 plus targets this week. Now, it's not the best matchup. The Chargers allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and that's why he isn't higher in the rankings. Then we go down to Xavier Worthy going up against San Francisco. And this just kind of feels like one of those games where an Xavier Worthy trick play could be dialed up. This dude is never safe to start, but if San Francisco can put points on the board, Kansas City is going to have to get creative. They do not have a ton of offensive weapons, but the way they utilize Xavier Worthy each and every game gives them that opportunity for the big play. After him, we go down to Ladd McConkey going up against Arizona, and while I can really see the Chargers taking advantage of the Cardinals on the ground, Ladd McConkey could easily have a solid day against them through the air as well. He's had 7 plus targets in back-to-back games, averaging almost 13 yards per reception, and Arizona allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we move down to Cortland Sutton going up against New Orleans, and with Bo Nix looking better and better each week, and with everyone in New Orleans being hurt right now, we could be looking at Cortland Sutton finding the end zone once again in week 7. He's got touchdowns now in 2 of his last 3 games, and New Orleans allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And then we round it out with Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against LA, and I couldn't really not include him in the top 36. He is still in the concussion protocol though, so if he does not make it, my next wide receiver up in the rankings would be Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. But like I mentioned earlier with Michael Wilson, this is a very difficult matchup going up against the Chargers, who allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. He has just too high of an upside to not include inside the top 36. We just need to see if he clears the concussion protocol. All right, so there you have the quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 7 fantasy football. Now, hopefully you enjoyed today's show. If you did, do me a favor by hitting the like button right now and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I don't care that the fantasy football season is almost half over. Now is a great time to join Headliner Nation. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here today, but hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.